couple years ago, I did a series on complex forms, which shows you how to manage multiple models in a single form. Well, unfortunately, that episode series is quite out of date. So here I'm revising that series and showing you the more modern techniques for handling multiple models in a single form. One thing that plays a big part in improving how this is handled is the accepts nested attributes for method, which was added in Rails 2.3. So we'll be using that throughout this series, and make sure to use the latest version of Rails to get this working. Now the documentation is pretty nice here. It basically shows you how that method works with nesting associated attributes in a single update call. But it's not really clear on how you would get this to work in the form in the view itself. So this is what this series will focus on. So let's first take a look at what I want to build throughout this series. And that is an application for making surveys. So as you can see here, I have a form. In this case, we're editing a survey where we can provide the survey name and then multiple questions for the survey and then multiple answers for each question. And as you can see, we have links for adding answers or removing answers and adding questions and so on. So basically a fairly complex form where we have, in this case, a deeply nested association because a survey has many questions which has many answers. And before, in the earlier technique I showed through the complex form series, it was not possible to have deeply nested associations like this, but here we are. So let's start making this application. I'm going to build it from scratch here. So we'll use the Rails command and let's just call it survey says. And then we just hop in there. Now just for convenience, I'll be using a couple nifty generators, which I can link in the show notes. The first one being the layout, just so that it looks a little prettier. Now we want three models here, survey, question, and answer, and each one of those are nested in the other. So let's first start by generating the survey model, which actually I'm going to generate an entire nifty scaffold for the survey model, and all we want is just a name for that one. And then don't forget to migrate the database. So now if we go to our application, you can see we have some nice survey scaffolding where we can create surveys and provide a name. But here we also want to supply questions and answers for the survey as well. So let's generate that question model. And we'll give it a survey ID column and a content column, which will just be a text field, so that'll contain the actual question. And as always, we'll migrate the database. So now in our question model, we want to set up the belongs to survey association, and then survey has many questions. And we can also set up dependent as destroy so that when we destroy the survey, it destroys the questions as well. Now in here, we can also call the accepts nested attributes for method, and that way we can pass in questions in here, and so that we can manage the question models through the survey just by whenever we update the survey's attributes, we can basically create and destroy and update questions at the same time. And now what we want to do is add fields for each of the questions inside of the survey form. So to do that, whenever you're managing an associated record, what you can do is use the fields for method and then just pass it the name of an association, such as questions. And that will loop through all the question records and then create a new form builder for each of them. So what we can do is then just insert basically form fields for each of these questions using this builder. So we can say builder dot, let's do a label first for the content attribute, but we'll call it question. And then we'll add a text field. Actually, let's do a text area for the content because it's going to have multiple rows. Let's say 3. And common mistake here, I need to access it through the builder of the question rather than through the builder of the survey model. Now if we hit reload here, you can see that, well, it doesn't look any different. And that's because we don't have any questions for this survey, so none of the question fields are showing up here. Now what we want is to have an add question link here, but before we get to that, let's just add some questions in this new action to get us started. So inside of the new action of the survey's controller, let's just create 3 separate questions. So survey.questions.build, and that'll create 3 questions so we can manage those in the form. And now when we hit reload, you can see, well, we have 3 question fields here because we have 3 questions in our controller. So let me just add these field values with the snap of my fingers. Okay, so now we can submit this. And that'll create a new survey record, but we don't see the questions yet because we're not displaying them here. But that's easy enough to fix. If we just go to that show page, I'll just paste in some code here to basically loop through all the questions and display them in a list. And then when we hit reload, there's our questions for our survey. So it successfully created the questions the same time it added the survey. And we can even edit the survey, and notice we have the question fields here, and we can just change one. And it just works. When we click submit, it updates the questions along with the survey. Now notice it added a 3rd question here even though the content is blank. It'd be nice if it automatically removed that. So what we could do is use the rejected if option on the nested attributes method, and this accepts a lambda. And what is passed into this lambda is a hash of attributes. So what we can say is if the content attribute is blank, then we want to reject it from creating a question with that hash. So now if we tried recreating the survey with a blank question at the end, click submit, and now notice it only submits those 2 questions. Now what if we want to delete questions after the fact? So when we're editing the survey, let's say we want to remove this question. Now ideally we would want to use a link here for removing questions, but here I just want to show you the simplest way first, and that is to use a checkbox. So let's add a new checkbox here through the builder. And the secret attribute name is called _destroy. And that way if this passes in true, then it will actually remove the record. And so we can add a label here as well for that destroy attribute and call it remove question. There we go. Now in order to get this to work, you also have to enable it in the accepts nested attributes form method. So we can do allow destroy and then pass in true to here. And that way it'll accept destroyed records. So now when we reload, we have a remove question checkbox. We check it, hit submit, and then, well, the question's gone. Okay, so we have questions, but we don't yet have answers. So let me generate that answer model and do some deep nesting here. So we'll generate that other model for answer, and then that'll have a question ID, and then also content field. Let's just give it a string value this time because I expect it to be shorter. And then migrate the database. And then we just set up the association. So answer belongs to a question. And for the question, I'm just going to basically copy the survey association so it has many answers. It's dependent destroy and nested attributes for answers, and then the same reject and allow destroy clauses. There we go. Now inside of our form we need to add fields for the answers, but it starts to get messy when we're dealing with multiple deeply nested models and builders, and also it's a good idea to move this into partial for later on because we'll want to handle creating questions through a link in JavaScript, and that'll help there. So let's move this into a partial called question fields. And then this can actually be a little bit shorter. We'll use a shorter version that Rails 2.3 provides, and you can just pass in a builder as an f variable. And then in that question fields partial, we'll just use that f variable here instead of the builder, so that way we just stay consistent. Now as for the answer fields, we can handle them very similar to how we handled the questions inside the survey form. So we use fields for answers, and so now we're going through the questions form builder for the answers. And we want the label content to be, the name to be answer, and we'll use a text field here instead of a text area for the answer because it's shorter. And also we'll leave that destroy link. And I also want to move this into its own partial, so we'll call that answer fields. And just like before, we'll clean this up a little bit, make it a little shorter, and move f as a builder object. And then finally, inside of that answer fields partial we created, we'll use that f variable in here as well instead of builder because that's what it's going to use. And let me just remove that break, and then there we go. And now, in order to get this to show up, we need to build some answers along with the questions in this new action here. So we can do that. So for each question, let's build 4 answers. And there we go. So now when we go to create a survey, we have 3 separate questions with 4 answers each, which we can fill in. There we go, and then we can submit this. And now we have our questions there. Our answers aren't being displayed, but we can add those. So inside of the survey show page, let me just paste some code in here, which loops through all the answers and just displays them as well. And then when we hit reload here, there's our answers along with our questions. So I hope this gives you some idea of how nested fields work, but we aren't quite done yet, of course, because when we're editing or creating a new survey, we want to be able to add more questions and answers through links, and I also want to use links for removing questions and answers as well. So there's still a bit more to do, but I'm going to cover that in the next episode.